Good evening. Welcome back. We are turning the page again in our study of the Old Testament, understanding the Old Testament. We've gone through the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. We have taken care of the historical books. We have, as of last week, finished wisdom literature books. And now we enter into the last portion of the Old Testament. The major prophets first, and then the minor prophets, which is all of the prophets together. And this is, again, a next step in our understanding of the Old Testament. And so because we ended off with Song of Solomon last week, because we're taking the books in order as they are placed in our English Bibles, that takes us now into the first of 4 major prophets, where we will deal with Isaiah tonight. And this is, for lack of a better way of putting it, and you've heard me say this about a lot of the books of the Old Testament, but this is a fascinating book. Isaiah is a fascinating book, and just fascinating in all of its content. In fact, when we talk about the prophets, of all of the writing prophets, we would say that Isaiah is justly accounted the greatest. When it comes to the prophets, especially when they are alluded to or quoted, not only in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, Isaiah is one of the ones that is quoted most frequently. And we see that as we continue in our introduction. His prophecy is one of the longest, 66 chapters, right? And he is quoted more frequently than any other in the New Testament, and he more often than any other prophet tells the coming Messiah. And so this is why, of all the prophets that we have in the Old Testament, Isaiah is the one that we often think of when we talk about the prophets. Now, we figured that Isaiah prophesied for about 50 years, and during his ministry, this was a very critical time for both kingdoms, Israel and Judah. So at the time that Isaiah was prophesying, Israel was not in captivity yet. They would be, but not yet. And of course, we know that Israel was the first to be brought into captivity. But Isaiah speaks with both kingdoms, more Judah than Israel, of course, but he does minister to both. And we find that Isaiah was greatly responsible for the sweeping reforms that were introduced by King Hezekiah. Remember when we were going through historical books, we talked about King Hezekiah and the reforms that he did. We believe that Isaiah, the prophet, was very instrumental in helping Hezekiah with those reforms. And Hezekiah was one of Judah's righteous kings, if you remember that. And not a lot of righteous kings that Judah had, but Hezekiah was one of them. And so here's why some of us get a little excited about Isaiah, right? He's the one that kind of introduces us to all of the prophetic ministry that's recorded for us in the Old Testament. Now, by way of introduction as well, and this is what we're going to be doing as we go through the major and the minor prophets, we're going to be talking about the times in which these prophets ministered, because the prophetic books of the Old Testament are not in chronological order. And what I mean by that is we wouldn't say that Isaiah was the first prophet and then everybody else lines in behind him. No. Each of the prophets ministered at a particular time during Israel's history, either prior to the Israeli captivity or prior to the Judean captivity, or during the times in which the divided kingdom was at its peak. And so as we go through the Old Testament prophets, we'll be helping you understand kind of where they fit in the history now that we've gone through the history. All right? So, Isaiah, very involved with the time of King Hezekiah and his reforms. Now again, 66 books in this, or 66 chapters, I should say, in this book that Isaiah writes, and because of the size of it, it becomes, we think, a little unwieldy. But what I've done for us is I've basically taken the book of Isaiah and divided it into 3 volumes. Remember when we talked about the first 5 books of the Old Testament? And we said it's a 5-volume set, right? We're doing kind of the same thing with Isaiah, but instead of 5 volumes, we're talking about 3 volumes, okay? And so chapters 1 through 35 we call the volume of heaviness. And the reason why we call it the volume of heaviness is because this is the time period where Isaiah is laying down the beating upon on the people of God, and the factor of exposing their disobedience, exposing their wickedness, and talking about the judgments of God that will come if they do not turn back to God. And so we call this the volume of heaviness. This is where Isaiah gets down to business with the people of God. Volume 2, just a short little volume, chapters 36 through 39, we call this the volume of Hezekiah. This is where Isaiah writes about King Hezekiah and his reforms, and a little bit about his reign. Just a short little snippet. Notice the first volume is 35 chapters, right? So over half of what the book is as far as its length. Just a few chapters with regard to the volume of Hezekiah, and then by the time we get to chapter 40, we talk then about the volume of hope. This is where Isaiah, after he's finished talking with the people of God about what God is going to do in judgment because of their sinfulness, these chapters, here's where Isaiah talks about what God is going to do after the judgment is complete. This is where Isaiah talks not only about the hope of God in the sense of the return of the people back to the land, but these are the chapters where Isaiah is going to talk about the Messiah, the coming Messiah. Not just about his first coming, but also about his second coming. That by the time we get down to the end of Isaiah, we even see Isaiah prophesying about times and places that we have yet to experience. For example, chapter 65, he talks about the new heavens and the new earth. Okay? So here's how we've divided Isaiah up to kind of give us a better idea of what's happening as we read through it. First volume is the volume of heaviness. Second volume is the reforms under Hezekiah, the volume of Hezekiah. Third volume, Isaiah talks about the hope of the coming king, the coming Messiah. And so that helps us understand a little bit better as we read through the book what period of writing that we're involved in, and helps us to understand a little better some of the flair and the poetic nature that Isaiah has in his writing. Now, before we get into the book itself, let's talk about the man, Isaiah himself. And we know, just simply from his writings, quite a bit about this man and his character and what it is that he means to the nation of Israel. Isaiah, we say, is the first of the four prophets, again known as the major prophets. Who are the four major prophets? Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. All right? Now, some say, well, what about Lamentations? Well, Jeremiah was the one who wrote Lamentations. All right? So that's the thing that we want to keep in mind there. But Isaiah is the first of the four prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel being those. And Isaiah's name is quite interesting when we begin to take a look at it. Isaiah actually is a short form of the prophet's name. The prophet's Hebrew name is Yeshaiah, okay? And so Isaiah, as we call him, is the short form of that. And the long form, which is how his name appears in his book, and all the other Old Testament references. That's why when you read some of the prophecies that Jesus talks about in the Gospels, and you'll kind of see a little bit of a different name, but you know it's Isaiah. That's the reason why. The long form has been preserved for us. And so, in all the other Old Testament references, we find, again, this long form, Yesha'ahu, okay? And so, it's an interesting name in itself. And actually, it's a compound name. What we mean by that is you kind of have two names brought together to form the name. So, this compound name has such meanings as Jehovah saves, okay? Or Jehovah is salvation, or salvation of Jehovah. Any of those combinations is a translation of Yesha'ahu, okay? Or you've heard of the term Yeshua, right? Jehovah, okay? You see Yesh in the name there, okay? So it's what we would call a compound name to help us understand what his name actually means. And we would say that this prophet was given this name by divine design. I don't think it was any accident that Isaiah received this name, because every time his name is mentioned, what's happening? It's reiterating the great theme of his message. What is the great theme of Isaiah's message? Jehovah is salvation. Jehovah saves. Salvation is of Jehovah. And so every time, at supper time, when Mom came out on the back porch of the house and called Isaiah in for supper, and as she's yelling across the neighborhood, because all the neighborhood kids are playing, right? I mean, we imagine that. We don't know that for certain. But every time his name is called out, what are you thinking, right? You're thinking about what that name means. And so I think this is the reason why the name was given him that was indeed given him. In the book which he wrote, two of his favorite words are those that are translated, he shall save, or salvation. So it just fits in with his name all in its totality. And that's why we would say that this name wasn't given by accident. This name was intentional. Now, when was it that Isaiah lived? Well, we have some ideas with regard to this. We don't know for certain, but with regard to his birth and his death, we really don't know when all of that happened. But if the date of Isaiah 7:3, okay, so let's take a quick look now. Isaiah chapter 7, and we take a look at verse 3. We find that the Lord said to Isaiah, go out now to meet Ahaz. Okay, so that gives us a hint. Ahaz was one of the kings, right? Go out to meet Ahaz, you and Shear-Jashub your son, at the end of the aqueduct from the upper pool on the highway to the fuller's field. Okay, so we have some historical cues there. The one is we have King Ahaz. Also, Isaiah's son, Shear-Jashub, okay? He was Isaiah's second son. Okay? So, if the date of Isaiah 7:3 is around what we would say 734 BC, that kind of fits in with King Ahaz and all the rest of it. And if Isaiah's son at that time was not a mere child, right? Because if he is taking Shear-Jashub with him to see King Ahab, obviously this is not an infant, okay? But we're talking about a son who is somewhat developed, right? Then Isaiah may have been born, we figure, around 760 BC. So we're kind of taking these historical clues and kind of working backwards from there to kind of get a time in which Isaiah lived. And if he was born around 760 BC, then we would say this, that Isaiah's early years were therefore spent in the prosperous, luxurious, carefree days of King Uzziah, right? You remember King Uzziah, chapter 6, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord, right? And it's trained from the temple. The same King Uzziah, okay? And during King Uzziah's reign, that's exactly what was happening. It was an age of prosperity. It was an age of affluence, an age of luxuriousness. And if you read chapters 2 and 3, Isaiah kind of helps us understand the degree of affluence that the people were experiencing under this King Uzziah. It's interesting when you take a look at Isaiah's prophecies and what he has to say, and when you compare them to the North American day and age in which we live, are we not living in a prosperous time? We are living in an affluent time. We have more than what the majority of the world dreams of, right? And it's interesting how Isaiah was prophesying at this time and how his message wasn't very popular. Just the same way as when we talk about the message of Jesus Christ, perhaps in a lot of cases not very popular these days of prosperity and luxury. This is when Isaiah lived. Now, from chapter 1, verse 1, we learn that most of the prophet's public ministry indeed took place during the reigns of these kings of Judah. Uzziah being the first, and then Jotham, and then Ahaz, and then Hezekiah. All right? So those 4 kings, if you go back into your history of Israel, okay, that gives you an idea as to the time in which Isaiah actually ministered in his prophetic ministry. And it is possible that Isaiah did no more public preaching after Manasseh succeeded Hezekiah on the throne. Manasseh was the next king after Hezekiah. Manasseh was just a bad dude all around, and did not follow after Hezekiah's steps at all. And it's commonly thought that perhaps even it was under the hand of King Manasseh that Isaiah died. We really don't know that for sure, but some traditional stories would tell us of that factor. Other prophets that were ministering during Isaiah's day would be Hosea and Micah. These are 2 examples of the minor prophets, okay? They would have been ministering at the same time that Isaiah was ministering, okay? And when we eventually get to Hosea and Micah, we'll be reminded of that. So, we figured this much, that Isaiah prophesied during the last 17 years of the northern kingdom, before Israel was taken captivity by Babylon, okay? Isaiah ministered for those last 17 years before they were taken off. His message, however, was primarily to the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, okay? And when Israel's throne, that's the northern kingdom, remember, when Israel's throne was tottering because of sin, Judah also was following her sister kingdom in the downward path. Though at slower steps, we know that Judah eventually was taken into captivity as well. Okay, so the northern kingdom taken into captivity by Assyria, the southern kingdom taken into captivity by Babylon, and Isaiah was there, okay, to minister before those times and to witness those times. He saw the fulfillment of God's judgment upon his people. So, this gives us a general idea as to when Isaiah lived and who ministered with him during that time. What was Isaiah's character like? What do we know about that? Well, we would say this first off, that Isaiah was one who was known to be bold and fearless. He was absolutely sincere. There was no way that you were going to get him off a task or off his mission. He was one who talked to his fellow countrymen in plain language, showing them how they looked in God's sight, and there were times that he did not pull any punches. That's one of the reasons why his message was so unpopular. He was too honest. He was too honest in how he told the people what God thought of them. And it wasn't all terms of endearment that he used. He used some strong language to help them understand that basically Isaiah at times gave what we would call scathing denunciations. In fact, there was no class of society that escaped these scathing denunciations. Whether you were rich, poor, whether you were of royalty or royal descent, or whether you were just a commoner, the message was the same across the board. Basically, Isaiah said this: you guys are dirty, rotten sinners, and God is going to judge you unless you turn back to him and just wait. God's coming. God's coming. And
would he at any time, because of how he was, people wanting to harm him?
Oh, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. There'd be people, all kinds of people that wanted to try and harm him, but that didn't come till probably King Manasseh. Finally, King Manasseh was the one that would catch up to him. Isaiah was stern. He was uncompromising when the occasion demanded. But we also see times in his writing where he is very tender-hearted, especially when we get into the volume of hope. This is where we see the tender-heartedness of Isaiah being revealed as he talks about the tender-heartedness of God. He was one who warned of judgment because, again, he loved the people of God. But he would also be like a loving mother. He would try to tenderly woo them to heed his counsel so that they could claim the prospects of a glorious future. He wanted them to experience what God wanted for them. And so he would tender-heartedly try to convince them to come to the side of God, even though they would not. Isaiah, we would say, was also a man of great spirituality and strong faith. Being one who was associated so intimately and constantly with God, he was one who had no place for worldliness. He was one who had no place for doubt. Either you were for God or you were against him. There was no middle ground. You couldn't have your feet planted in either camp. And he was uncompromising in that way. But that was a demonstration of his spirituality and faith, because he had a close, intimate relationship with God. And he saw people and things from God's point of view. What was God's point of view? Eternity. You've heard me say in some of my messages here, and you've heard me say even as we've talked going through the Old Testament, the eternal perspective is the perspective that we need to have as followers of Christ. Isaiah was no exception. He said to the people, we need to keep eternity in mind, because God is in control of it all. God is the one who is bringing about the eternal consequences. Why would we resist him? Why not follow him? All right, and so that's why he was helping them to see things from God's point of view. We would also say this as well. Isaiah was a many-sided genius. This particular fellow, he was no slouch. His ministry of prophecy was enhanced by the fact that he was a gifted poet. All right, and as you read, if you were to read the book in the original language, you would see the eloquence and the poetry that he employs. This was not just some common man. Isaiah was obviously one who had education that a lot of people did not have, and so he was a poet laureate. He was a statesman in the fact that he was able to capture crowds by his messages and keep them mesmerized by the messages that he would have. In fact, he was quite a gifted orator. Okay, people listened to his message in the factor of listening to its beauty and to its content. They didn't follow, but what Isaiah had to say, when Isaiah spoke, basically people listened. Why? Because of the evidence of the giftedness that he had in this area. In fact, when we take a little look further at Isaiah and his life and his ministry, we would say this, first of all, that, we really don't know a lot about Isaiah's personal history. Why is that? Because he doesn't write about his personal history. Now, again, as we read the book and as we see some hints and clues dropped here and there, it helps us to come together with a pretty good understanding of who he is. But remember, the emphasis in the Bible is given to the message rather than to the man. Isaiah is no exception. Okay? Isaiah isn't going to talk about himself. What he's going to talk about is the message of God. That's what's emphasized. And so all we know, for example, about his parentage is that he was the son of Amos. Okay? If we go back to chapter 1, all the way back to chapter 1 of Isaiah, and we take a look at verse 1, here's what we find written. The vision of Isaiah, the son of Amos. Okay? So that's all we know, basically, about his parentage. His dad was Amos. But who was Amos? Well, good question. His father may have been a person of prominence. 13 times in the Old Testament, Isaiah is referred to as the son of Amos. Okay? But that's, again, about all that we know. Because of how often he's referred to as the son of Amos, this is why we're making the assumption that he must have been somebody of promise and of prominence. Jewish tradition would say that Isaiah was of royal descent. Okay? A brother of King Amaziah was named Amos. Okay? And if that is the case, then Isaiah would be a cousin, Isaiah would be a cousin to King Uzziah. That's perhaps why they had the close relationship they had between the king and the prophet Isaiah. Now, we don't know that for certain. Jewish tradition plays into that story, okay? But it is interesting nonetheless. Now, this royal descent idea comes from a couple of clues that we see in the book itself. For example, Isaiah's writings show that he was blessed with a fine intellect and a good education. The grammar that he uses in the Hebrew, that is recorded for us, is not just a commoner's Hebrew, but it is a Hebrew of another level, okay? And so that would give us an idea here that, yeah, we're talking about one who is rather intellectual, one who probably had a good education. To have a good education in Isaiah's day and age usually meant that you had connections with those in authority, all right? We find Isaiah was very familiar with the scriptures, as well as he was one who was well posted on the political affairs of his day, okay? He knew what was going on in the kingdom. He knew what was going on with these kings. Hence, again, some of the other reasonings why we're wondering whether or not he did have some type of royal descent. But that's about as close as we can come, because we really don't have any more information other than that.
So it wouldn't be in the genealogy of family lines or anything, eh?
Those genealogies wouldn't take us back into the royal family line.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That was totally separate.
Yeah, because when we see a look at, or to take a look at the genealogies as they're given for us in the Bible, it all comes back to the line of who? David, right? Or the line of Adam, or what have you. It doesn't go outside of the Jewish family tree, right? And so that's why we don't have that information. Isaiah was a married man, by the way. He had a wife, and she was a prophetess. He was a prophet. She was a prophetess, and they had 2 sons together. And if you want to talk about weird names, okay, then you talk about Isaiah and his wife. They were ones who came up with some really neat names. They had 2 sons whose names were Maher-shalal-hash-baz. Okay, that means speedy is the prey. Okay, and then the second son, Shear-Jashub, which means a remnant shall return. Now, as in the entire Old Testament, as is recorded for us, names were never given by accident. Names that were given to children, names that were given to people, always had some type of significance. No exceptions here. So even though it's a really weird name, Maher-shalal-hash-baz, okay, and I can say that 10 times quick, right? I don't even know if they shorten it down or whatever, just Mahar or whatever, I don't know. But there's a significance to these names. These peculiar names illustrated the 2 great points in Isaiah's message to his nation. Maher-shalal-hash-baz being the first one that was born, and then Shear-Jashub being the second one. So first, with Maher-shalal-hash-baz,
Call them hash for short.
hash, there you go, yeah. If the nation refused to turn from their idolatry, this was Isaiah's message to the people, right? If the nation refused to turn from their idolatry and sin, what was God going to do? Isaiah said, God would punish them by allowing a nation to conquer them, okay, and carry them out of their land to remain captives in another country for many years. What does Maher-shalal-hash-baz mean? Speedy is the prey. Okay, see how that connection comes? The picture, actually, of Maher-shalal-hash-baz, that name, there's the picture of a ferocious wolf pouncing upon a lamb and taking it away to its den. That's the message that Isaiah was giving to the nation. If you do not turn to God, another kingdom, another nation is going to come in just like a wolf and going to grab you like a lamb and take you back to its den, to its home. Well, what did King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon do with the kingdom of Judah? Came in, destroyed Jerusalem, took the people away to Babylon. All right? So we see how Maher-shalal-hash-baz is that name, that every time his name is repeated, what does it remind Isaiah and Mrs. Isaiah of? What does it remind the people of every time they hear the name? Every time school attendance was taken, right? And the teacher would call out, Maher-shalal-hash-baz, okay, are you here, right? Every time the teacher would say that name, that would be a reminder. Speedy comes the prey, right? Hence the reason for the name. The second son, Shear-Jashub, much easier to say, Okay, much quicker to say. Well, the second name symbolically prophesied that after God had punished the nation by his captivity, what was God going to do, right? He would allow them to return to their own land, but that only a remnant would avail themselves of this opportunity. That was the second part of Isaiah's message. Okay? After the judgment is done, God will restore you and you have the opportunity to come back to the land. But it will only be a remnant who comes. Not everybody will come, but only a remnant. Shorjation. What does it mean? A remnant shall return. So isn't that interesting now? These names, and by the way, God directed the names that were to be given for these sons. Okay? Every time their names are repeated, those thoughts come through the mind. The 2 points, the 2 major points of Isaiah's message as he prophesied for 50 years in the kingdoms. And so again, no accident.
Did you mention what his wife's name was? Or
No.
where she came from? No way.
No, we have no understanding of it. In fact, Isaiah does not refer to his wife by name. If you go to chapter 8. If you go to chapter 8, and verse 3, notice what Isaiah writes here. Then I went to the prophetess, and she conceived and bore a son. Then the Lord said to me, call his name Maher-shalal-hash-baz. Okay? Notice he doesn't refer to his wife by name, just the prophetess. Okay? So that's all we know. We know he was married. We know he had 2 kids, 2 sons, but that's all that we know. Okay? Now again, the time and circumstances of Isaiah's death are not known. There's nothing recorded in the text for us with regard to his demise, but again, according to Jewish tradition, okay, it is believed that he was sawed in half, okay, by the wicked king Manasseh. Remember, he was the one that came after Hezekiah, and 2 Kings chapter 21 reminds us of the conquests of King Manasseh. He was regarded as a bloody king, okay? And why the sawed in half idea? Well, if you take a look at Hebrews chapter 11, where it talks about that great chapter of faith and the demonstration of those who had faith, and then it goes into the last part of chapter 11, where the Hebrew writer says we don't have time to talk about all of the others, right, that stood for God and how they were killed for the faith. And sawn in two is one of those ways in which martyrdom took place. We're wondering if that is an allusion or a reference to the prophet Isaiah. All right? And there's different frescoes and pictures of how that may have happened, where they may have strung Isaiah up by the ankles and hung him upside down, and they would just start the saw at the bottom end. Always, again, remember he's hanging upside down. They would start at the bottom end, and they would just saw right through until they got to the bottom, which was where the head was. It's unimaginable. But it's amazing how over the centuries people have died heinous deaths at the hands of people who want to deny the only one and true God. Well, in fact, we see from our news reports that it's still happening today. So Isaiah may not have been any exception. Again, this is what tradition would tell us. We have nothing in the text that would indicate that. But,
He may have felt nothing too.
he may have, yeah. We do not know. So that's what we know about Isaiah, the man. Let's talk a little bit about his book, okay? And let's begin with the style of his book, okay? It's a unique style in itself. The book of Isaiah is basically a series of discourses written by the prophet, okay? And they were delivered at different times and on different occasions. So here's what brings about some challenge or perhaps some difficulty in understanding what Isaiah wrote. Isaiah wasn't one who necessarily would tell you that he was switching from one topic or one theme to now a different theme or a different topic. And so sections of Isaiah, you read them and you read what he has to say, and you're, okay, is he referring to this or is he referring to this? Because there's no necessarily rhyme or reason or order to these discourses. It's as if he took his discourses and kind of just jumbled them all together and this is what you have. For example, it's interesting. We're introduced to Isaiah chapter 1. He's the son of Amos and so on. But Isaiah doesn't talk about his call to the ministry until chapter 6. Okay? How does that work? How did that work? That's again some of the challenges with this style. He delivered these discourses at different times and on different occasions, but nevertheless, we also remark that Isaiah's style is lofty and what we would call strongly rhetorical. Okay? Again, he excelled as an orator. And he designed his discourses to attract and stir his audience. You know the difference between speakers, right? You have a person who can speak, and then you can have a person who not only can speak, but holds the audience in the palm of his or her hand, right? Because of the way in which they speak and the style in which they speak. Isaiah was one of those, right? Where he would design his discourses as ones that were designed to attract and stir his audience. And though his writing is not, technically, it's not poetry. Okay? So even though his writing is not poetry, what he does use is many of the devices of the poet, especially figures of speech. You'll find figures of speech throughout the book of Isaiah, even though he is not writing poetry. Technically, he uses some of the devices. As you go back into the original language, you find that he excels in a variety of vocabulary. If you want to get your Hebrew vocabulary education, read the book of Isaiah, because you find unique words there that you don't find in the other books of the Old Testament. This is the skill that Isaiah had. And he would use, and how he was able to use these words to convey powerful truths. In fact, we would say that perhaps the most biting and stinging method that he employs in his writings is that of satire. Okay? So, even back in Isaiah's day, satire was something that was quite effective. Now, what is satire? Satire is that use of sarcasm, right? Or irony to expose or rebuke actions and attitudes. And so, in one sense, while the people are listening to his satire and laughing, at the same time, what is happening is he's exposing them for who they really are. So they're laughing and finding themselves being pointed out as being the perpetrators. A great example of this is in chapter 44 of Isaiah. So let's take a couple of minutes to look at this, because this really helps explain and vividly pictures for us this method of satire that Isaiah uses in his messages. Isaiah 44, and we're picking it up at verse 13. All right, we're picking it up in verse 13. Notice what he writes. The craftsman stretches out his rule. He marks one out with chalk. He fashions it with a plane. He marks it out with the compass, and makes it like the figure of a man, according to the beauty of a man, that it may remain in the house. Now, why is it going to remain in the house? Because it's going to be the idol that they worship. Okay? Now, notice what else he says now in verse 14. He cuts down cedars for himself and takes the cypress and the oak. He secures it for himself among the trees of the forest. He plants a pine, and the rain nourishes it. So as he's chopping down these trees, he's also planting other ones, right? Verse 15. Then it shall be for a man to burn. So why is he harvesting the wood? Not just for making an idol, but the same wood that he uses to make the idol, what is he going to do with that wood? Well, notice. He cuts down, verse 15, then it shall be for a man to burn, and he will take some of it and warm himself. Yes, he kindles it and bakes bread. Indeed, he makes a god and worships it. He makes it a carved image and falls down to it. He burns half of it in the fire. With this half he eats meat, he roasts a roast, and is satisfied, even warms himself, and says, "Ah, I am warm. I have seen the fire." And the rest of it he makes into a god. His carved image, he falls down before it and worships it, prays to it and says, "Deliver me, for you are my God." They do not know nor understand, for he has shut their eyes so that they cannot see, and their hearts so that they cannot understand. And no one considers in his heart, nor is there knowledge nor understanding to say, "I have burned half of it in the fire. Yes, I have also baked bread on its coals. I have roasted meat and eaten it. And shall I make the rest of it an abomination? Shall I fall down before a block of wood?" He feeds on ashes. His deceived heart has turned him aside, and he cannot deliver his soul, nor say, "Is there not a lie in my right hand?" Notice the satire. Here he goes out to the forest, cuts down a tree. Half of it he uses to worship, and the other half he just uses it as fuel to make his meals and to keep his house warm. How silly is this? But yet, that was the condition of the people. Their satire.
There's poetry there too.
Yeah, their satire. So at the one hand, as he's saying the message, the people are laughing, right? How silly to find this guy going out and doing, this with the wood, and then, oh, wait a minute, that's what I do. Oh, now it's not so funny anymore. The satire has been used to expose what's been going on, right? And that's the style of Isaiah. That's the style of Isaiah. All right? Similarity of outline. What we mean by this is that in all of the discourses that Isaiah does, there is a similarity to the outline of his messages. They're kind of all the same. The character and the broad outline of these discourses of Isaiah are very similar. We would say this, that there are 4 points that can usually be seen in his discourses. The first point will be some type of an indictment or accusation, where he will start his message and say, "You people, you have to understand what you're guilty of. And here's what you are guilty of. You are guilty of rebelling against God." That's basically how he would start his discourses. And then he would get to the second part of his discourse where he would talk about some type of threat. Listen, if you guys don't turn around, God's coming. If you guys don't turn around, God's gonna deal with you, and he's gonna deal with you harshly. If you don't turn around, God's gonna get you. Okay, that was basically the second point of his discourses, where then he would then get into that exhortation or entreaty where he would say, listen, rather than letting God get you in judgment, why don't you come back to him? Here's the things that you need to get rid of. Here's the things that you need to change. Here's the things that need to be no longer part of your life. And here's how you can come back to God. The exhortation or the entreaty, so that by the time you get to the fourth part of his message, he would say, and if you do this, if you do these things, then here's what God is going to do for you. And he gives some type of promise of purification or blessing. When you take a look at all of his discourses throughout these chapters, you'll find that that is the basic pattern every time. Okay? So that should help you in your reading of the book, in seeing where in his discourse, okay, where's the indictment, where's the threat, where's the exhortation, where's the promise, right? And as you see that, you begin to understand a little more clearly what is happening in Isaiah's writings. We also have to talk about the songs of Isaiah as well. So, Clark, this will be down your alley, right? In the sense that although Isaiah is not a book of poetry, we find in his writings various songs and refrains that appear throughout the book, especially what we would call the servant songs, right? Where Isaiah talks about the Messiah. Behold my servant, right? Who I uphold, right? These are those servant songs where Isaiah talks about the coming Messiah, the coming King, the coming Christ, who would come and deal with it. All right. So that's the book of Isaiah, kind of in a nutshell with regard to its content. Let's take a look at its prominent subjects. Okay, the prominent subjects of Isaiah. First of all, we have to deal with Isaiah's call to the prophetic office. God called him to this office of being a prophet. And we figure that he must have received his call to the prophetic office at an early age. In order to minister for 50 years in the prophetic ministry, it would be obvious that he would be of an early age when he was called. And of course, this call is described vividly for us in chapter 6 of his book, where he sees the angels with 6 wings, right? And he sees God in his temple. He says, "Woe is me, I am undone." The angel comes with a coal and places it upon his lips. He says, "Woe is me, for I am an unclean man. I'm a man of unclean lips," right? And the angel purifies him. That's the symbol of purification, when he puts the coal of fire upon his lips, right? And God says, "Who will go for me?" Or is not who will go for me, who will go for us, right? And Isaiah says, "Here I, send me," right? All the rest of those things. We have this call of God very vividly described for us in chapter 6. Isaiah is also full of warning and comfort. He basically, like most of the prophets do in the Old Testament, he basically preached a twofold message. A warning of judgment for sin, the comfort of salvation for righteousness. Turn from your sin, turn back to God. God will bless you, okay? If you don't, God will judge you, right? Warning and comfort. Of course, the messianic prophecies are very key to Isaiah as well. Isaiah is known mostly for his messianic prophecies. In fact, there are more messianic prophecies in Isaiah than any other prophetic book. So if you want to see where most of the messianic prophecies are, go to Isaiah, because that's where they are located. And so with this is why one can easily see why Isaiah is called the evangelical prophet. Okay? What we mean by that is where Isaiah talks about the plan of God and his plan of salvation for humanity. Of course, Isaiah being a prophetic book, right? He's a prophet, it's a prophetic book. There is, of course, the prophetic perspective that we need to deal with it. Isaiah, like many of the prophets, was given divine revelation concerning 4 prophetic points, okay? And we find this not only in Isaiah, but we find it in the other prophets of the Old Testament as well. 4 main prophetic points that the prophet will deal with. First of all, he'll deal with his own time, right? And Isaiah did, where he's talking about what God is going to do to the people, or for the people, in the time in which he lives. But Isaiah will also talk about the coming captivity. It hadn't come yet, but he will prophesy about the coming captivity. That's the second prophetic point that he does in his ministry. But he also talks about, and here's the third prophetic point that he will concentrate on in his ministry, where he talks about the coming of Christ. Okay? So we go from the prophet's own time, and then we start talking about the coming of Christ. We're talking about wide gaps of time. And this is why we have it illustrated the way we do in this picture here, where you see 4 mountain peaks, right? The 4 prophetic points of the prophet's ministry, but between the mountain peaks, there's lots of valley, lots of space, right? And but Isaiah concentrates on those main 4 points. So he talks about his own time, talks about the coming captivity, talks about the coming of Christ, and he also talks about the new heavens and the new earth, that 4th prophetic point that is so important and which applies mostly now to us. Those 3 previous prophetic points, that has already been fulfilled, right? That 4th prophetic point, the second coming of Christ, the new heavens and the earth, that still is yet to come. And Isaiah talks about that as well. Now, let's take those 4 prophetic points, prophet's own time, coming captivity, coming Christ, new heavens and new earth, and let's see how these are distributed throughout the book and the summary of each. So, again, when the prophet is talking about his own time, he's giving messages concerning this, the messages concerning his own time. They appear throughout the book themselves. We see where Isaiah talks about the time in which he lives. Okay? And foretelling here is Isaiah's major role. Not foretelling, but forthtelling. What do we mean by forthtelling? This is what you people are like in God's sight. If you don't change, this is what God is going to do. He's telling it like it is. Forthtelling. Okay? Thus says the Lord. Okay? The forthtelling. This is concerning the prophet's own time. When we get to the captivity, and his prophecies with regard to the captivity, we see that Isaiah foresaw Judah being taken captive by the Babylonians. And he talks about this to the people of Judah. He says, this is what's going to happen. This is what God's going to do. Again, remember, Maharshal Hashbaz. Okay? The name of the son talks about what is coming down the pike. Now, God was the only one who knew when the captivity would come. Isaiah didn't know when it would come, but he knew it was coming. It was just a matter of when God was going to let the gavel fall. And in fact, the first mention of Babylon, or the name Shinar, which we would see in our text, okay, that's the same name for Babylon. Babylon is mentioned as the captor in chapter 11. Okay, so let's take a quick look at let's just take a quick look at that. Chapter 11. And verse 11, it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people who are left, from Assyria to Egypt, from Assyria and Egypt, from Pathros and Cush, from Elam and Shinar. That's Babylon, okay? From Hamath and the islands of the sea. He's talking about the time when the remnant will return after the captivity, okay? And this is where Babylon is mentioned. In the days of King Hezekiah, the prophecy then of the coming captivity was made very clear, because when you go up to chapter 39 now, chapter 39, notice what Isaiah writes in verse 6 of Isaiah 39. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and what your fathers have accumulated until this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord. And who is the king that Isaiah is speaking to? Hezekiah. All right? That's the king that he is speaking to. All right? So, this is where the prophecy of the Babylonian captivity is made very clear. When Isaiah prophesies about the coming of Christ, this is where these prophecies now abound in chapters 40 to 66. This is why we call it the volume of hope, right? And here's where we find the prophecies about the coming of Christ. And these prophecies concern not only the first coming, but also concern the second coming. Okay? So, that creates, again, a bit of a challenge as you're reading Isaiah, because when he talks about the coming of the Messiah, well, which coming are we talking about? Are we talking about his first coming, or are we talking about his second coming? Okay? Isaiah doesn't necessarily make those demarcations for us, and so that causes us to read the text with a little more, perhaps, intensity. Okay? And then that fourth prophetic point, the new heavens and the new earth, that is still located in the volume of hope, right? Isaiah prophesies of end times, especially with reference to the millennium. What is the millennium? The 1,000-year reign of Christ, where he comes to earth with his saints, and he reigns on the earth for 1,000 years. Isaiah has a lot to say about the time of what we would call the millennium, with Christ as the Prince of Peace and the elect nation of Israel gathered together after their worldwide dispersion. So they come back to Jerusalem for this time. And of course, the most distant horizon that Isaiah sees is the new heavens and the new earth. Let's go up to chapter 65, the second last chapter of the book. Isaiah 65. Notice verse 17. For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, and the former shall not be remembered or come to mind. Okay, so even to that day that we're still waiting for, the millennial time, this day that we're still waiting for, Isaiah prophesies about this in his book. So, you can see why Isaiah is such an intriguing and amazing book. It's just packed full of things to discover and to learn together. But let's get down to that final question that we have, right, with regard to the book of Isaiah. So what? Basically, 6 things that we want to go through quickly. 6 things we want to go through quickly. The divine call to Christian service. We're exposed here in the life of Isaiah to God's divine call upon himself and what it is that he wants Isaiah to do. This is a great example of how God is involved in his divine call and how he is often involved in the call of people to serve him, what we would say, full time. And again, I hesitate to use that term because we don't want to be guilty of saying that if you're not involved in Christian service, then what you're doing is not of God. That's not what we're saying. But what we're seeing here is that Isaiah was not called to just anything. He was called to serve God in a prophetic way. And God still calls people to serve him in a specific or a significant way. And not everyone is called to that. But God calls some to that. And Isaiah gives us a glimpse into this and what that looks like. Living in light of who God is. Isaiah is a great book to help us with that again. Where he's telling people, it's not what God does or doesn't do that's important. I mean, the reason why they were not following him was because he wasn't doing what they wanted him to do. If God does this, then we'll follow him. That's not how God operates. God is much more interested in us understanding who he is rather than what it is that he does. Now, does God do amazing and wonderful things for us? Absolutely he does. But the fact of the matter is, the reason why he does those things is because that's his nature. That's his character. We need to be worshiping God for who he is, not for what he does. Isaiah reminds us of this as we read through the book, that we need to be ones who live in the light of who God is, rather than what it is that he does. If you want to talk about confession of sin, Isaiah is a great place to talk about confession of sin. Because what Isaiah does often in this book is he confesses the sin of the people to God. Trying to preserve their relationship with him, of whatever might be left, if there's anything left. But Isaiah understands that it's the people's sinfulness that is causing the challenges and the problems that they're working through. It's because of their sinfulness. And he calls upon the people to confess their sin before God. If you would confess before God, if you would agree with God that what you were doing is wrong and come back to God, things would be different. And so he talks a lot about confession of sin. Also talks a lot about hardened hearts. Whereby the people have hardened their hearts toward God. They're not going to respond to him. In fact, as God calls Isaiah to ministry, he tells Isaiah, listen, you'll be speaking to people as if they are deaf. You'll be showing people about the principles of myself as if they were blind. They won't see it. They won't hear it. You'll speak until you're blue in the face. You'll shout until you can't be heard anymore, and the people will not respond. That's what Isaiah knew from the beginning of his prophetic ministry. Here is a book that helps us to understand how hard our hearts can become against God and against his principles, and how hardened we become in all of that. God said, with ears they will not hear, with eyes they will not see.
That's the question.
Yeah.
But so when they talk about the remnant,
Yeah.
were those the ones that were not hardened in their hearts?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Right? They come back. They come back to the light. Judgment for sin, of course, is it's all through the book of Isaiah, especially the first 35 chapters, where Isaiah talks about the fact that God will judge, and he does. Again, when we look at the history of Israel, back in the historical books, we see how God judged them. The northern kingdom of Israel taken into captivity to Assyria, the southern kingdom taken captivity to Babylon, and nothing was left. When Nebuchadnezzar came in and took the people from Jerusalem away, there was nothing left. There was nothing left of Jerusalem when he was done. Of course, we can't escape either the redemptive ministry of Christ for humanity, right? Again, you can't get through the last few verses of Isaiah 52 and through chapter 53 without understanding God's redemptive plan, right? His servant would be the one who would give his life for the people. And the last part of chapter 2 and all chapter 53 talks about how God will take his servant and will crush him and will bruise him and will slay him. Why? Because he will be the one that will pay the price for the people. God's redemptive plan for humanity is revealed for us with even more detail in the book of Isaiah. The hint of God's redemptive plan for humanity was given back in Genesis. Remember Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, right? He shall bruise your head, or he shall bruise your heel, but you shall crush his head, right? And gives us that hint of God's redemptive plan. It's going to be one who comes for the people. By the time we get to Isaiah, when we get into chapters 52 and 53, we see the extent of what's going to be required in order for that redemption to take place. Right? It's going to be through a suffering servant. And that's what Isaiah reveals to us. That's what's going to be necessary for the redemptive plan of God to take place. Blood will be spilled. A servant will represent the people. It will be one who takes on the wrath and the judgment of God on behalf of the people. Well, when we get into the New Testament, this is why then the disciples begin to put two and two together after the resurrection of Christ, after they see all of what took place. And Jesus sits down with them and says, listen, was this not what Isaiah prophesied? And he shares in the Gospels how he sat with them and taught them from the Scriptures why these things were to be. I guarantee you, chapters 52 and 53 of Isaiah was one of those passages that Jesus went back to explain to his disciples the redemptive plan of God. And as he talked about it with them, the lights came on in the disciples' minds and hearts. Now I see it. Now I see it. The redemptive plan. Isaiah reveals that for us as he talks about the first coming of Christ. Well, there's Isaiah. And it's packed. And if this is any indication of what the rest of the prophets are going to be like, we're in for quite a ride, right? And so there's Isaiah, and we've gone quickly through it, the 66 chapters that it is. When we get together next, then we will deal with the next prophet in line in our English Bibles. After Isaiah is Jeremiah. We'll go from the prophet that is stern to the prophet who weeps. That's Jeremiah, and we'll look forward to that when we get together next time. Let's pray together. Father, again, thank you for your revelation in your word. Thank you for what it teaches us, how it helps us to understand your nature and character. And Father, we thank you for the prophet Isaiah, what he spoke about, what he taught. That even though he was teaching it to a nation of people that would not hear, even though he was speaking to a nation that would not see, Father, he was faithful in his ministry to you. And we have preserved for us the discourses that he gave to the people to help them understand what God was going to do for them. Father, cause us, as we would take time to perhaps read this book, as we would take time to read your word, help us again to see this redemptive plan that you have had for us since the beginning of time. May we see it clearly. May we see how it applies to us. And may we as your people respond to what it is that you've done for us. We pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.